Joining me on this extra special edition of the Show About the Show podcast. I'll tell you, I've done over 50 of these episodes, and this is probably without a doubt one of my favorites and definitely the most special one to me. Ladies and gentlemen, I have today Josh Rawitch, the president of the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. That's right, the Hall of Fame president is on our show. Josh, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Devin.
Let's talk a little bit about the Hall of Fame. So it was the first members were established in 1939. Can you kind of talk about that early period in the history of the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, what's cool is that this town was really a pretty impressive town even before the Hall of Fame came along. James Fenimore Cooper, who most people would know is a famous American novelist, his father actually founded the town, and people would come here really to see where James Fenimore Cooper, where his house was. There's a gorgeous lake. I mean, Cooperstown's an incredible place, independent of the Hall of Fame. And our chairman of the board, Jane Forbes Clark, her grandfather, basically had the idea, along with a couple other people here, that if you put a museum in this little town in upstate New York, where they at one point believed baseball was founded, that maybe people would come. And it's been an incredible success story. It's really one of the earliest stories of a town using tourism to basically stay alive. And so it really led to, like you said, the opening in 1939, which at the time they believed was the 100th birthday of baseball, the centennial celebration. And you
Right.
had people like Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb, and Babe Ruth came in after his induction that day, walked down the street and pinch hit a Doubleday Field, and really the stories have kind of just continued from that day forward.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about some of those, you think about a lot of Abner Doubleday. He's a name that you hear a lot of in early baseball history, and I think a lot of people erroneously think that he's somebody who created or maybe invented or came up with the original idea of the Baseball Hall of Fame. But I think they do that because they want an American hero, somebody who was tied to the Civil War, to be associated with the national pastime. Can you talk about kind of the whole Abner Doubleday thing?
Yeah, so the Doubleday myth really kind of started in the early 1900s if you know the name Spalding, Albert Spalding, the sporting goods
Yep.
magnate. He was also a Hall of Fame baseball player. He had taken teams to Egypt on tours. I mean, really an incredible guy. And they were trying, as you said, to figure out who created baseball. And I think their hope, as we've come to learn, was to prove that this was an American sport, that this wasn't a British version of rounders, that this was a truly American sport. So they sent something out in all the papers around the country saying, please tell us your earliest memories of baseball. And when a miner in Colorado named Abner Graves sent in a letter and said, I was in Cooperstown in 1839, and Abner Doubleday laid out the bases in this field, it just sounded like a great story. And like you said, this guy was a Civil War hero, and he was dead, so he couldn't tell anybody that he didn't invent the game. And it just sounded fantastic. And really, the powers that be in baseball ultimately said, this is the story we're going with. And it ultimately ended up to be a myth, very much so. But I think from my standpoint, it's been a great myth because it's allowed the Hall of Fame to be where it is here in Cooperstown, and really where we are the spiritual home of baseball. Even though Doubleday has kind of since been seen to have nothing to do with it, it's still a pretty cool story.
But it's still neat too, don't you think that there is that tie-in between baseball and the American Civil War? Because I think a lot of people kind of look for that connection. And Ken Burns talked about this kind of in his baseball documentary, was that a lot of people think that the reason Abner Doubleday was created or credited with inventing it is because they wanted somebody who was an American hero
Sure.
to have invented the American sport and thus, living on forever through the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality though is that we, as an institution, our job is to preserve history, and so what we
Right.
want to do is preserve real history, not myths. And that's,
Right.
I think, it is to your point. It is actually very cool that we actually have a number of artifacts in our collection. We have a baseball that we regularly, well, it's not currently on display, but it's in our archives downstairs. That is from like I think 2 months after the Civil War ended, a gold leaf
Oh,
baseball that was part of one of the clubs that helped start baseball way back in the day. So I mean, there we continue to as the country moves along, so does the sport of baseball. And literally, I was just sitting on my desk right here. I was just thinking about this letter here. I have a letter here from Commissioner Seelig to me shortly after 9/11 that was
okay.
basically his letter to all employees in baseball. And when you think about, I've always kind of saved this on my desk. Um, our country was at this incredibly sad period of time, and yet baseball helped save it. We all think about the '01 World Series, or you think about the
Absolutely.
World War II and baseball continuing to keep people employed and happy. And so those are the sorts of things that are why we are the American pastime.
Absolutely. And kind of going off of that too, I think it's interesting that, I think the casual baseball fan, obviously, they know the names Ruth Gehrig, Ty Cobb, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron. They might not know the names Effa Manley, who's actually the only woman to be inducted in the Baseball Hall of Fame. They might not know Oscar Charleston or, people like that. Can you kind of talk about, especially World War II, in terms of the All American Girls Professional Baseball League, and kind of how you, like you mentioned, FDR was really institutional in keeping that going, but it also helped keep baseball going.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the great things about this Hall of Fame is that we aren't just uh, focused on Major League history. We're not owned by MLB. We are an independent entity, and so we have a full exhibit that's on women in baseball, and a huge portion of that is, in fact, the All American Girls Professional Baseball League, which I think, as most people know from League of Their Own, wound up really coming from the fact that many of the top players in baseball had to go off to war. And as you mentioned, Effa Manley was an owner of a Negro Leagues team, and that is, like you said, the only female inductee into the Hall of Fame, but certainly belongs there as much as any of the other executives who have their names on the wall in the plaque gallery. So I think that's what makes this place so special, is that you may come here thinking, "Oh, okay, I know all of the big names," and then
Right.
you spend 15 minutes and you learn. I mean, I learned something new every single day about the history of the game, about the people in the game, and history literally happens every single day. I mean, this week we've brought in multiple artifacts from current events in baseball. So I mean, history doesn't have to be 1903 or 1945 or 1974. It can be 2023,
Right.
literally yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that. That's a great segue. We've talked, about the different parts of time in the Hall of Fame, but one thing that's happened this year that's never happened in the history of baseball is we have a player who hit 40 and 70. We have a 40-70 player. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, a 40-40 was impressive. What Ronald Acuna is doing is he's the only player that's ever done it in the history of
Yeah,
baseball. What
yeah.
plans do you guys have to get stuff from him from this season?
Yeah, it's funny actually. We were just talking about this earlier today. We obviously are going to reach out. We wanted to kind of see where the season ended and put in our ask of the Braves, and ultimately what we try to do. It's not like we're going to ask for six different things from Ronald Acuna. Like ultimately, we want one representative artifact that will go to the
Right.
Braves, and whether it's a jersey or cleats or something along those lines. What we really try to do is look at the stories that are truly historic, and it's actually pretty amazing when you think of the history of the game. There's a lot of things that happen that are really cool, but they may not be historic. And so we
Yeah,
have only so much space. We can't
right.
collect five things every day, even though you open up your app and you see six really cool things that happen. So I
Yeah,
don't know specifically on the Acuna front, but I do know that certainly before the end of the season, we're going to have an ask in for him, as well as several of the others who have had pretty amazing years or that did something specific. And that literally happens almost every day here. We're having a conversation about who are we reaching out to at the Orioles or the Diamondbacks or the Reds.
sure. Speaking of the Orioles, I think it's only respectful that we talk about Brooks Robinson. The baseball world, and more importantly, humanity and humankind lost just an amazing human being yesterday. Do you have any Brooks Robinson either artifacts or stories that you can share, or tell us some of the things that you guys have from Brooks Robinson's time as a player on the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, we do have several artifacts. And actually, one of the things I would encourage people that listen to this to do, like if you go on our website and you see in the digital collections, you can literally search anybody that interests you and you can find their collection on there. And I think that's pretty cool. I do believe we have one of his gold gloves and I think several other of his artifacts. But honestly, the what has stood out to me in the last 24 hours since his passing is that I guess it's 48 hours or so. Um, People talk about his kindness. People talk about his humility far more than 1970 World Series or his 16 Gold Gloves, and all the
Right.
things that we know he did on the field. He spent far more of his life not playing than playing. And what he
Right.
did as a human is what, I mean, the people in the office here talk about how anytime we needed anything at the hall, he was always there. He always wanted, he would, if we were coming down to Washington, D.C. to lobby a congressperson on a coin that we were trying to make, he was like, I want to be there. If we had an event going on that we needed him at, he was always there. He was always signing autographs. He was always friendly and kind. And those are the sorts of, he was on our board of directors for many, many years. So I've gotten to know him a little bit over my 2 years here, more so over the phone. Unfortunately, he wasn't traveling much his last couple of years, but just an unbelievable human being who I think just understood what it meant to be a major leaguer. And he understood what it meant to be revered by others. And it never turned him into something else. He really, he loved the game. And he used to say, I love the game. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm in the Hall of Fame. And that's pretty cool.
It always seems like from what I've read, yeah, you're absolutely correct. People have talked about the human side of him more than the ball player side. Is it hard for players when they get inducted in the Hall of Fame, from your experience, to be able to kind of have that level of humbleness? Or because, I mean, to be honest, getting into the Hall of Fame is kind of, the Mount Rushmore of baseball accomplishments for a lot of people. So you would understand if they would get a little bit big head about it. But from your kind of opinion and your viewpoint there, kind of being in the forest, do you see that a lot of players just are humbled by the fact they're among the all-time greats who have ever played the game?
Yeah, it's not a lot of players. It's literally every one of them. Everyone that I've come across, to me, is basically, even if they may have had a reputation during their playing days of whether it's being surly or being uber competitive in their, like,
Right.
don't talk on the day I pitch, or whatever reputation they may have had. I do believe that once you get inducted into the Hall of Fame, there is just something that I watch them. They walk around. They're totally humbled by the experience. They're humbled by who they're sitting on the veranda of the Otasaga with.
Stage
It's
with.
just, yeah, and on
Yeah.
the stage, yeah, it
Yeah.
is an impossible thing. I think about how humbling it is for me to be in this job, so I can only imagine if you
Right.
got here the way they got here, just how humbling that is. And it happens to every single one of them, and that's one of the cool things. And it's probably true at the Rock and Roll Hall or the Hockey Hall or basketball or football, that
Right.
when you are that good at what you do, that the whole world has kind of said you're, in our case, top 1% of anybody to ever do it. It
Right.
has to humble you when you walk in here and you see what we're talking about, 200 years of history being documented here.
Yeah. And obviously, the Baseball Hall of Fame is, for a lot of people, it's a controversial subject because for a lot of people, you can't talk about the Hall of Fame without talking about Pete Rose, and you can't talk about the Hall of Fame without talking about Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and the steroid era. I want to know what your thoughts are on that whole, not maybe that controversy, but if you kind of have a general idea as to whether or not those issues are going to resolve themselves, or if that's going to be kind of it's never going to get figured out kind of thing.
Yeah, I think they're very different issues. I think when you're talking about someone like Pete Rose, who's on the permanently ineligible list by Major League Baseball, that's been a longstanding rule of ours that if you're not eligible per MLB, you're ultimately not eligible to be on our ballot. So I think that's a different case where unless MLB ultimately changes their rules, or if we were to somehow change ours, Pete Rose isn't at the point where he would even get looked at. Whether it's any of the others who either tested positive for PEDs or for whatever reason are believed to have used them. You can list the names, many of whom were just recently on the ERA committee ballot. They will continue to get looked at by an independent group of 16 people, many of them Hall of Famers themselves, famous executives, long-term executives, historians. And so I think probably for many years to come, that group's going to get looked at. And I really don't know how it will turn. I think there is clearly something very special about the Hall of Fame that we do consider character and integrity and
Absolutely.
sportsmanship, and those are things we are, as a sport, we're held to a higher standard, and we're okay with that, and so we hold our inductees to a higher standard. But that's also not to say that if the voters, that group of, if the BBWAA or if that group of 16 had ever or ever does decide to induct anybody who tested positive or was suspected, we'll of course honor them the way that we would honor anybody else. And I think the thing that many people miss in this conversation, frankly, because we have it a lot, you're right, we hear it all the time.
Right.
You can come to the Hall of Fame here, and there's a whole museum that focuses on all sorts of things. We have artifacts from Barry Bonds and Pete Rose and Roger Clemens and Shoeless Joe and all these other. And we're not that just because they're not in the plaque gallery doesn't mean they're not represented in Cooperstown. And I recognize it's a very different thing to be in the plaque gallery. But
Right.
when people say, "Man, it's not a Hall of Fame if Pete isn't in there," well, you can actually go see Pete's shoes and his jersey and his bat, and you can. It's all over the three-story museum. We are way more than just a plaque gallery with names on walls.
So, as the president of the Baseball Hall of Fame, do you feel like you're as much of a baseball fan? Do you feel like you're as much of a historian and a preserver as you are a president of a Hall of Fame?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to think I'm all of those things. I mean, I am. I'm certainly not a curator. We have people who are professional curators whose
Right.
knowledge of baseball history dwarfs mine, and then some. We have all sorts of people here who have spent a whole career studying and really diving deeper into topics than I've ever been able to do. Um, but I do consider myself certainly a lover of baseball history. I have an incredible passion for the game. Spent my whole career in it, and long before that, spent my whole life in it, playing it all the way up until they told me I was not good enough to play it in college. That's when I walked away. But I always, yeah, I do consider myself a fan, and as the person who's really, in a lot of ways, just the steward of this office, literally this office. I had several predecessors who sat in the same seat at the same desk. It's an amazing place to come to work every day and to think about what we get to do, which is really preserve history, honor excellence, and connect generations.
You talked earlier about having that ball from a couple of years after the Civil War. What do you think, or what do you know? What, in your opinion, is the rarest item that the Hall of Fame has in its collection in terms of either scarcity or historical value?
Yeah, I mean the crazy people ask us that quite a bit, and the reality is that you can't be more rare than one of one. And I would bet of the 40,000 three-dimensional artifacts and 3 million documents we have, like the overwhelming majority of them are one of one. Like there is only one bat used by Hank Aaron to hit home run number 715. There's only one pair of shoes worn by Zach Gallen last year when he broke
Yeah.
a shutout streak. So I mean, the
Yeah.
reality is they are all one of one. So in terms of rarity, I don't know that I could give you that. I did actually. This is pretty neat. There's for those that don't realize, we have a membership program. You can become a member of the Hall. And in doing that, you get a magazine 6 times a year. So I was just proofreading right now today the next magazine. I was looking at it, and it's our theme. I'll give a little people won't a little sneak preview, but our theme is Hidden Gems of the Hall. And I was
Okay.
reading about a single baseball card from I can't remember what year it was, but Casey Stengel basically. Long story short, it is believed to be the only baseball card of its existence. And then when you think about baseball cards, even the Honus Wagner, there's however many 50 in existence. There's a lot of them out
Right.
there, maybe not all graded at the levels, but the Stengel card that our magazine refers to is literally the only one that people know is out there, and that's of something that has reproduction. So while you can't get a second helmet from Ronald Acuna's 30-70 game,
Right.
you in theory get multiple baseball cards of a kind, and we have some here that are literally the only in existence. So it is mind blowing what is in this building. Everywhere you turn, you have something that is the most rare thing you could possibly have.
Do you personally like, aside from being the president of the Hall of Fame, as being Josh Rawitch, who's your favorite Hall of Fame and why?
You said you cut out. You said my favorite Hall of Famer and why?
Yeah, who's your Hall of Famer? Take the president hat off and put the baseball fan hat on. Who's your personal favorite Hall of Famer and why?
Oh man, it's the hard part is that there are so many that either I love because I grew up loving them, like Sandy Koufax. Those
Right.
who aren't alive, Jackie Robinson. I grew up a Dodger fan, and so I still every time I walk over to Jackie's plaque, it amazes me. I obviously got to work with Randy Johnson at the Diamondbacks, so him being the only Diamondback who's in there. I mean, the reality is there are so many of these guys that I love. I mean, the idea that I get to sit down and have conversation. Earlier today, I was actually chatting with Jim Cott about he's heading down to Brooks's funeral or his memorial ceremony on Monday, and I'm going to be down there. And we were just going back and forth. And I just got to know Jim Cott in the last year, but I absolutely love him. He's the classiest human around. So it is impossible for me to say who my favorite Hall of Famer is. There are really there are about 75 living guys, and I'm fortunate enough to at this point I think call most of them a friend, and I'd hate to pick one friend over the other.
I hear you. Do you have a favorite item in the Hall of Fame? Even if it might not be something like a Babe Ruth bat or a Hank Aaron this. It could be a Zach Gallen pair of shoes, like you meant. Do you have a favorite item in the Hall of Fame?
I wouldn't say I have one. I would say a couple. When I get asked that question, a couple of times I've given this sort of answer. So one is that I grew up a Dodger fan in Los
Yep.
Angeles, and the last out from the '88 World Series, which was my
Okay.
childhood team,
Yeah.
that baseball is here. And shortly after I got the job, Fred Clare, the GM of the Dodgers, who was the one that donated the baseball, kind of made a comment in the paper that he was happy that I was going to be there to look after it. And so I kind of, obviously I'm not the one looking after that baseball, but certainly that one impacts me a lot. And I would say also, having spent as much time at teams as I did, there's a number of artifacts that ultimately I helped get here. I was on the receiving end of the request from the Hall when Andre Ethier had a 30-game hitting streak, and they called my office and said, can you go ask Andre if he'll donate this? And so the other day I came across that bat in storage, and I just thought, that's crazy. Like, somewhere 15 years ago, so I could have never imagined doing this job. And so to me, I think obviously the ones that have personal stories, but I almost every day I walk into the museum and see some new artifact that blows my mind that it exists. And if it's not in the museum, it's downstairs in collections where we have 90% of our artifacts are not on display. We have, like I said, documents and photographs and baseball cards that just, it is literally like asking someone to choose a favorite child. It is very hard to give you one that falls into that category.
And the cool thing that I really think is really neat about the Hall of Fame is that, and I've never been there, but just kind of knowing the history of baseball like I do, it really does tell a story. Like, it starts by being this game that came over from, or that was more or less introduced or created from rounders and a combination of rounders and cricket. And you get the Abner Doubleday stuff, and you get the late 1800s, the John McGraws, the Cap Ansons, guys like that. And then it kind of goes into that dead ball era where you get, you know, Cap Ans and Ty Cobb, all that kind of stuff. And then to kind of totally shift and go into Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Lou, Mickey Man. Like, it's so crazy to think that one museum has 140 years of basically pages and chapters and different pictures and books and videos. Like, do you just walk into the museum and ever get overwhelmed, but in the good way of like, I'm so glad, because I'm a history major, so like I understand preservation. Like, I collect mostly vintage stuff. So when I see something that's, from the Twins in 1961, I'm like, ooh, I know that there aren't a whole lot of those left, and it's been around 60 years. I want to keep it
Yeah.
another, you know, do you just ever walk into the museum and just like you're overwhelmed and like, I'm so glad that we have all this stuff, especially a lot of that like pre-World War I stuff.
Yeah, honestly, I think it happens almost every time I walk in a museum. I mean, we have an entire exhibit focused on really baseball in the 1800s before it really became the modern game. And as you learn about that, it doesn't actually make sense that we could have so many things from that time period. And yet
Yeah.
we do. And I think it says a lot about the people who came here before me and before the people working here. I mean, for 80 something years, we've had people dedicated to this. And again, just to give you a little sneak peek of that story I was reading today that talked about our library. Like, people don't realize we have the greatest baseball library known to mankind. I mean, it is
Yeah.
thousands of books and millions of documents. And when that started in the 30s, it was literally, there was a person here who basically put a call out to America saying, send us your stuff we want to try to preserve the game. And people did by the thousands, and people had to actually sit down and curate it and log it and make it so that it's now searchable and findable. And it absolutely blows me away that for 8 decades people have been sitting in these same offices and trying to figure out how do we make sure that 80 years from now we have all the same really cool stuff. And so we spent a lot of time just thinking about how do we maintain this far beyond our own lifetimes, because that's really, I think there's a great line that Bob Costas gave in the film that we show here. When you come to the hall, there's an amazing 15-minute film that just kind of kicks off your day, and it's just so well done. It makes me cry every time I watch it. But he said this idea that you can be connected to someone you never met, that's what happens at the hall. And it can be Babe Ruth, or it could be Cap Anson, or it could be whoever it is. Fleetwood Walker. I mean, there's so many stories that go back, and people feel a connection to them, even if they died 75 years before you were born.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite players that I love reading about is Rube Waddell from Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, because
Yeah.
I enjoy the characters as much as I love the player. And Rube was such an interesting character, but he also was one of the greatest left-handed pitchers of the 1900s.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's I think when you look at the stories behind all of these guys, there's numbers on a sheet that are obviously in a lot of cases why somebody got into the
Right.
hall. But when you dig into their stories and you understand who they are and how they
Right.
got to where they are, and you learn, I mean, just like any human, as someone who's long been a communications professional, like I could sit down with almost anybody in America and find an amazing story behind them. And these
Mhm.
Hall of Famers are no different. They are humans with incredible stories behind them, who their parents were, how they got to where they were. It just, right now I'm reading Ricky Henderson's biography, and it just, you look at what that guy did to get where he is, and it just like it doesn't make sense. Or there's another great line in our film where Juan Marichal talks about, if you grew up where I grew up in this tiny town in the Dominican, you wonder how could someone from there get all the way to Cooperstown? Like it doesn't.
Yeah,
It just it stretches credulity that that's possible, and yet it happens every
absolutely.
day.
So I know we need to get going. I am a Twins fan, so I would be reminiscent if I didn't say, hey, do you have any Twins artifacts or anything you can show me? My favorite player ever is Kirby Puckett, but can you show me some cool Twin stuff or tell me some cool Twin stories?
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, what's actually pretty neat. We actually had an intern here, the very first intern class, Dustin Morse, who's now vice president of the
Yep.
Twins.
Yep.
He is, in a lot of ways, we talk about him as like he's one of my closest friends in the game, but he is the model for our internship program because he's gone on to have such an incredible career. But what I want to show you here is pretty neat. Unfortunately, I couldn't get actual artifacts in here because we don't really like bring them up when we have to. But
Right.
you'll see here, we have a starting nine, which I'll show you, and then
Yep.
I'll tell you some of the stuff on here. So for all 30 teams, in this case, whether it's Johan Santana's Cy Young jersey, we've got Jack Morris's World Series game ball from Game 7. We've got an actual sign from inside Metropolitan Stadium. We've got a Homer hanky, which I heard they're bringing back the hankies this year. I saw that on Twitter.
They did.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. They're red.
a championship ring from the '87 team. You've got Gene Larkin's sac fly. There's the World Series winning baseball. Tomei's 600th home run. Joe Mauer's 2000th hit helmet. And so these are the sorts of things that when you walk around, literally every team that you know, whatever team you love, whatever strikes you in baseball, you can walk around the museum. And then those are actually ones that are scattered all out the museum. We actually have an entire locker with more current stuff. So modern stuff that could have happened literally this year. I'm trying to think about a Twins moment from this year that we got something from. But it's you have to come here. You have to see it to believe it. It is just truly an incredible place for baseball history. And if you're a Twins fan, hopefully you're watching this. You'll come here and you'll come say hi when you get here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Guys, we have to let Josh go. He's already given us more time than we were admitted. Josh, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a thrill of a lifetime for a boy from St. Paul to talk to the president of the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. It's unbelievable. I cannot thank you enough for your time.
I appreciate you having me on, and good luck to the Twins here down the postseason run. And You never know. Maybe I'll be standing in the clubhouse after the World Series collecting things from their championship.
We would like to start with one game first,
Yeah,
but
I know.
yes, yeah.
I know the
Hopefully,
history of it. Well, good luck and thanks for having me.
thanks, Josh.
Okay.